Imagine standing at the peak of the known world, your empire stretching from the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean to the lush river valleys of India. You're only 32 years old, and you've achieved what others could only dream of. Then, in the span of just a few feverish days, it all comes crashing down. That's exactly what happened to Alexander the Great in the year 323 B.C. Just days after falling ill, the legendary conqueror who reshaped the ancient world was dead. No elaborate farewell, no final battle, just silence, confusion, and a mystery that has haunted historians for more than 2,000 years. Was it a sudden illness that stole him away? An accidental poisoning, or something far more sinister? A carefully plotted assassination designed to bring down a king at the height of his power? The truth is, we still don't know. Alexander's death remains one of history's most tantalizing unsolved cases, a riddle wrapped in legend, politics, and whispers of betrayal. And in this video, we're going to dive deep into the evidence, the theories, and the intrigue that still surrounds his final days. You're about to step into the role of a historical detective, sifting through ancient accounts, conflicting testimonies, and hidden motives. Together, we'll examine the suspects, ambitious generals, political rivals, even those closest to him, and ask the hard questions that scholars have debated for centuries. This isn't just a story about how a great man died. It's a window into power, loyalty, and the fragile nature of legacy. So settle in. We're going back more than 2 millennia to unpack one of history's greatest mysteries, the sudden, shocking, and suspicious death of Alexander the Great. After years of relentless campaigning, Alexander returned to Babylon in the spring of 323 B.C. He wasn't coming home to rest. The city was buzzing, a hub of activity fueled by the king's restless ambition. He was planning his next great ventures, a naval expedition to conquer Arabia, and even grander schemes to push west, possibly toward the rising power of Rome and Carthage. The known world wasn't enough. He seemed driven to master all of it. This period was marked by a whirlwind of activity and celebration. The king attended feast after lavish feast, honoring visiting dignitaries and rewarding his loyal companions. It was after one such event, a drinking party hosted by his friend Medius of Larissa, that everything changed. Alexander was reportedly in high spirits, enjoying the wine and the company. But later that night, he was suddenly struck by a sharp, debilitating pain. The invincible conqueror, who had survived countless battles and wounds, was swiftly overwhelmed by a powerful fever. The man who had built an empire was now confined to his bed, his body waging a war he could not command. What began as a celebration quickly turned into a medical crisis. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was a sudden, searing pain that gripped Alexander shortly after he drained a large cup of unmixed wine. In the ancient world, wine was typically diluted with water, so consuming it straight was not only a sign of a hardy constitution, but also a potential shock to the system. The pain was so intense and abrupt that it was later described as if he had been struck by a spear. This was no ordinary stomach ache. It was a violent, debilitating onset that signaled a catastrophic internal event. A raging fever swiftly followed the initial agony, burning through the king with a ferocity that left his physicians deeply concerned. This was Alexander the Great, a man whose physical endurance was the stuff of legend. He had marched his army across deserts, scaled frozen mountain passes, and recovered from near-fatal battle wounds, including a pierced lung. Yet here he was, utterly laid low by an invisible enemy. His immense strength seemed to drain away by the hour, replaced by a profound and worsening weakness that confined him to his bed. Over the next several days, those around him could only watch in horror as his condition rapidly deteriorated. The vibrant, commanding general who could inspire armies with a single speech was slowly slipping away. His voice grew faint, then hoarse, until he reached a point where he could no longer speak at all. Imagine the scene: the most powerful man in the world, rendered mute and bedridden, surrounded by his generals and physicians who are utterly powerless to stop his decline. The atmosphere in the palace must have shifted from concern to outright panic, thick with fear, and the unspoken question on everyone's mind: was this a natural illness, or had something far more sinister been set in motion? The ancient historians who recorded Alexander's final days were not physicians, but their detailed observations provide the only window we have into his symptoms. Plutarch, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, described a sudden, violent pain that struck Alexander after he drank. The king cried out as if pierced by a sharp spear, a detail that suggests an acute abdominal catastrophe. Arrian and Diodorus Siculus then document a relentless, high fever that left the conqueror increasingly weak and eventually unable to speak. The entire ordeal lasted less than 2 weeks, a terrifyingly rapid decline for a man in his early 30s known for his robust health. Translating these ancient descriptions into a modern diagnosis is a complex challenge for historians and medical professionals. The symptoms don't neatly align with any single common illness of the time, which has led to a wide range of theories. One long-standing hypothesis is that Alexander succumbed to a severe case of malaria, a disease that was endemic in the marshy regions around Babylon. The high, recurring fever fits, and it could have been triggered by a mosquito bite days before his collapse. Another prominent theory suggests typhoid fever, which was common in areas with questionable sanitation and could explain the abdominal pain and rapid progression. Yet other medical experts have proposed more unusual causes. Some point to acute pancreatitis, potentially brought on by heavy drinking and rich feasting, which would account for the sudden, excruciating abdominal pain. Others have wondered about a perforated peptic ulcer or even acute alcohol poisoning leading to a fatal crisis. There's even a controversial theory that Alexander might have contracted West Nile virus or a form of meningitis. The problem is that each of these conditions has symptoms that match parts of the historical account, but none perfectly explain the entire clinical picture described by the ancient sources. This diagnostic puzzle is compounded by the nature of historical reporting. The accounts we rely on were written decades, and in some cases centuries, after the fact by authors who had their own biases and sources. They were describing medical events without a modern understanding of disease, using terminology that can be ambiguous. A fever could mean many things. Severe pain is not a precise diagnosis. Furthermore, the progression of symptoms might have been influenced by the treatments attempted by his physicians, which included bloodletting and potentially harmful purgatives, common practices that could have accelerated his decline rather than halting it. This leaves us with a fascinating but frustrating historical medical mystery. We are essentially trying to solve a 2,300-year-old case with a handful of second-hand clues. The lack of certainty has allowed numerous theories to flourish, each with its own compelling arguments but none with definitive proof. This medical ambiguity is precisely what fuels the darker, more sinister theories. When a natural cause can't be established beyond doubt, it opens the door to the possibility that his death wasn't natural at all. This rapid and devastating decline, so thoroughly documented yet so medically ambiguous, makes the theory of typhoid fever one of the most compelling natural explanations on the table. The ancient descriptions of Alexander's illness read almost like a textbook case of this bacterial infection. It begins with a high fever that spikes and falls but never truly breaks, accompanied by profound weakness and a distinctive abdominal pain that can be severe enough to feel like a piercing wound. As the disease progresses, it can lead to dehydration, confusion, and even a state of quiet exhaustion where speaking becomes a tremendous effort, all of which eerily mirror the accounts of Alexander's final silent days. The bacteria responsible for typhoid fever, Salmonella typhi, thrives in environments where sanitation is poor, spreading through contaminated water or food. And ancient Babylon, for all its grandeur, was likely a perfect breeding ground. The city was a sprawling metropolis built along the Euphrates River, a water source used for drinking, bathing, and waste disposal. While the hanging gardens were a marvel of engineering, the city's sewer systems were primitive by modern standards. In the crowded, bustling streets, with its large population and constant influx of visitors from across the empire, the conditions were ideal for a waterborne disease to flourish. A single contaminated well or a tainted meal served at one of the many feasts could have been all it took to infect the king. Supporting this theory is the timeline of the illness. Typhoid fever has an incubation period of roughly 1 to 2 weeks, meaning Alexander could have been exposed long before his symptoms ever appeared. He might have already been harboring the bacteria during his final celebrations, feeling perfectly healthy even as the infection quietly multiplied within his body. This hidden incubation period makes the sudden, dramatic onset of his illness less mysterious. It wasn't an instantaneous event, but the culmination of a biological process that had begun days earlier. Furthermore, the course of his sickness aligns with the brutal, 2-week progression of an untreated severe case of typhoid. The high fever, the abdominal torment, the gradual weakening leading to a state of quiet delirium known as the typhoid state. Each step finds a parallel in the historical records. Even the potential for intestinal perforation, a deadly complication in the infection's later stages, could explain the initial spear-like pain that reportedly brought the mighty king to his knees. Yet, as convincing as this medical detective work may seem, it is not without its complications. Some medical historians point out that while typhoid fever explains many symptoms, it doesn't account for every detail in the ancient text. For instance, a notable absence in the accounts is any mention of the rose-colored spots on the abdomen that are a classic, though not universal, sign of typhoid. More significantly, the ancient sources emphasize that Alexander remained mentally clear until very near the end, while advanced typhoid often brings significant confusion and delirium much earlier. This gap between the historical description and the clinical profile leaves just enough room for doubt to keep other theories alive. It demonstrates the immense challenge of retrodiagnosing a patient from 2 millennia ago based on second-hand reports. We are piecing together a puzzle where some of the pieces are forever lost to time. The typhoid fever theory provides a powerful, plausible narrative of a conqueror brought low by a microscopic enemy more formidable than any army, a tragic victim of the unsanitary conditions of his own magnificent empire. But the lingering questions ensure that the debate is far from settled, inviting us to consider other, more malicious possibilities. This medical hypothesis gained significant traction in the late 20th century thanks to the work of Dr. David W. Whodunit, a prominent pathologist and medical historian. In a landmark 1998 study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Whodunit and his colleagues meticulously re-examined the ancient accounts through a modern clinical lens. They argued that typhoid fever presented the most coherent and complete explanation for the entire constellation of Alexander's symptoms, from the initial crippling pain to the final, quiet exhaustion. His analysis wasn't just a guess, it was a rigorous differential diagnosis that systematically weighed typhoid against other potential culprits like malaria or influenza and found it to be the strongest fit. Dr. Whodunit's support for the typhoid theory wasn't based solely on symptoms. He also pointed to a deeply personal and tragic piece of evidence from Alexander's own life. Years earlier, Alexander's beloved friend and suspected lover, Hephaestion, had died quite suddenly from a violent illness. The descriptions of Hephaestion's own rapid decline are strikingly similar to what Alexander would later experience. Dr. Whodunit suggested that Hephaestion may have also died from typhoid fever, meaning Alexander would have been exposed to the same bacteria before, potentially leaving him with some level of immunity that was later overcome by a massive new dose of the pathogen in Babylon. This wasn't just a random infection, it could have been a cruel twist of fate, a second encounter with a deadly foe that had already taken someone he cherished. The environment of Babylon itself provides the final, crucial piece of evidence for this theory. The city, though magnificent, was a public health nightmare waiting to happen. It was a dense, overcrowded urban center where human waste contaminated the same waterways used for drinking and cooking. The Euphrates River, the lifeblood of the city, was also its sewer. Alexander's army, along with a constant flow of diplomats, merchants, and camp followers, would have placed an enormous strain on the city's primitive sanitation systems. In such a setting, a waterborne disease like typhoid would have been endemic, a constant, invisible threat. For a king participating in large public feasts, where food preparation hygiene was rudimentary at best, the risk of consuming contaminated food or water was incredibly high. This theory paints a profoundly ironic picture. Alexander the Great, the master of continents, the man who could command the movements of vast armies, was ultimately brought down by something he could not see and likely did not understand. His death becomes a historical tragedy, a case of a conqueror felled not by a rival's sword, but by the microscopic realities of the world he ruled. It is a sobering reminder that no amount of power or glory can grant immunity from the natural world. Yet, even with this compelling natural explanation, a shadow of doubt remains. The very speed and specificity of his decline, combined with the intense political turmoil that immediately followed his death, have always made the possibility of foul play too tantalizing to ignore. Yet for all its compelling logic, the typhoid theory can never fully extinguish the far darker and more dramatic alternative that has smoldered for centuries, the persistent whisper of poison. This is the classic conspiracy, the theory that Alexander the Great was not struck down by a disease, but was deliberately murdered by someone within his own trusted circle. The suspicion of foul play didn't arise generations later. It erupted almost instantly in the tension-filled rooms of the Babylonian palace as the king lay dying. His powerful generals, the very men who had fought beside him for a decade, began casting suspicious glances at one another, their alliances fracturing as they contemplated a future without their leader. This theory of assassination was not invented by modern historians. It is woven directly into the oldest accounts we have. Several ancient sources, including the Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus, report that on his deathbed, when Alexander was too weak to speak, his loyal commanders asked him to whom he left his vast empire. His alleged heartbreaking reply was a single word: to the strongest. This answer, whether real or apocryphal, speaks volumes about the atmosphere of ruthless ambition and impending chaos that surrounded his final hours. It suggests that even Alexander himself foresaw the bloody power struggle that would follow his death, a struggle that some of those same generals might have been eager to accelerate. The political motivations for such a plot were overwhelming. By 323 BC, Alexander had become an increasingly isolated and autocratic figure. His adoption of Persian customs, his demand that his Macedonian veterans prostrate themselves before him in the style of an Eastern god king, had deeply alienated the old guard who saw these acts as a betrayal of their Macedonian traditions. He had also recently purged several high-ranking officials, creating a climate of fear and resentment. For a powerful general like Antipater, whom Alexander had recently ordered replaced as regent of Macedonia, or for others who feared falling out of favor, the king's death was not a tragedy, it was an opportunity, perhaps even a necessity for their own survival. The historical record adds fuel to this fire through a controversial and mysterious source known as the royal journals or the ephemerides. These were said to be the official court diaries, a detailed day-by-day account of the king's final acts and meetings. Several ancient historians, including Plutarch and Arrian, claim to have used them as a source. The journals reportedly presented a very detailed, almost hour-by-hour account of Alexander's decline, describing his fevers, his baths, and the moments he could still converse with his commanders. They paint a picture of a natural, if swift, illness. However, many modern scholars suspect these journals were a clever forgery, fabricated after the fact by one of the likely suspects, possibly Antipater or his powerful son, Cassander, to provide an alibi and quash the rumors of poisoning that began to swirl immediately. If the official court record stated it was a sickness, who could argue? It was the perfect cover-up, a piece of ancient propaganda designed to control the narrative and secure power in the tumultuous aftermath. The very existence of such a meticulously documented, yet potentially fabricated, account makes the poisoning theory impossible to dismiss. It suggests that those in power felt the need to actively suppress a rumor, and in doing so, they may have revealed their guilt. If Alexander was indeed poisoned, the immediate question becomes a matter of both method and opportunity. What substance could have possibly been used to mimic a natural illness so effectively, and how would the assassins have administered it without detection? The ancient sources themselves point to a specific culprit, a poison drawn from the icy waters of the river Styx. This wasn't just a mythical reference, it was a real and terrifying substance known to the Greeks. The water of the Styx was believed to be so corrosive that it could shatter any vessel except one made from the hoof of a horse or a donkey. Historians like Plutarch mention this detail, suggesting that the poison used was so potent and rare that its origins were wrapped in legend. Modern toxicologists have proposed that this describes a highly acidic, natural mineral water, possibly contaminated with deadly calachimicin-producing bacteria, which could cause violent and fatal reactions. This points to a sophisticated knowledge of poisons far beyond a simple plant extract. The most widely discussed candidate, however, is white hellebore, a common but brutal plant-based poison in the ancient world. Known for its purgative properties in tiny, controlled doses, hellebore was a double-edged sword frequently used by physicians. In a larger quantity, it becomes a weapon. Its effects are horrifyingly close to the descriptions of Alexander's suffering. It begins with a scorching pain in the throat and abdomen, followed by violent vomiting, intense diarrhea, severe cramping, and a crippling dizziness that leads to a staggering gait, hence its ancient nickname, the crazing poison. A victim would then succumb to a profound and worsening weakness, often culminating in cardiac arrest. This timeline of agony and collapse over several days aligns almost perfectly with the king's documented decline, making it a prime suspect for any conspirators who wanted his death to look like a sudden, devastating illness. Another powerful possibility comes from the seeds of the Strychnos nux vomica tree, the source of what we now call strychnine. This toxin is terrifyingly efficient. It acts as a neurotoxin, causing violent, painful muscle spasms throughout the body. These spasms can be so intense that they cause arching of the back, a symptom known as opisthotonos, and are often triggered by the slightest touch or sound. Crucially, strychnine poisoning does not dull the mind. The victim remains fully conscious and acutely aware of the excruciating pain until the very end, which could explain why ancient accounts emphasize Alexander's mental clarity even as his body failed him. However, strychnine typically kills through respiratory paralysis within a matter of hours, not days. This faster timeline is a significant strike against it, unless it was administered in a series of smaller, sublethal doses designed to prolong the suffering and mimic a wasting disease. We must also consider a slower, more insidious killer, arsenic. While the rapid, intense fever might not seem to fit a classic arsenic poisoning, a compound known as arsenic trisulfide or orpiment was well known in the ancient world. It was used as a brilliant yellow pigment in paints and dyes, and its toxic properties were certainly understood. A calculated, repeated dose could indeed produce symptoms like severe gastrointestinal distress and organ failure, leading to death over a period of days. The advantage for a potential assassin using arsenic would be its subtlety. It could be added in small amounts over time, slowly weakening the king and making his final, public collapse appear to be the culmination of a natural sickness rather than a single, dramatic poisoning event. This leads to the crucial question of delivery. How does one poison the most closely guarded man in the world? The ancient accounts provide a tantalizing clue: the wine. The story points to Iolaus, the cup-bearer and brother of Cassander, one of Alexander's most prominent rivals. During that fateful drinking party at Medius's home, the poison could have been concealed in the wine itself. But a simple drop of poison in a king's cup would be a risky move, easily detected by a food taster or by the wine's altered taste. A more ingenious method involves chilling the wine in a poisoned container. If the inside of the wine cooler or crater had been lined with a toxic substance like white hellebore, the cold liquid would slowly leach the poison out without affecting the flavor. The first few cups might be safe, but as the party wore on and the king, being the guest of honor, was served from the bottom of the crater, he would have consumed an increasingly concentrated and lethal dose. This method is deviously clever, ensuring the target receives the poison while others may only suffer minor, non-lethal effects, perfectly explaining why Alexander fell so violently ill while others at the same feast remained unharmed. But if we entertain the idea of poison, our investigation must turn to the most likely conspirators, the individuals who had the means, the opportunity, and a powerful motive to want the king dead. At the top of this list stands a formidable family: Antipater, the seasoned regent Alexander left in charge of Macedon, and his ambitious sons Cassander and Iolaus. Their potential involvement isn't just speculation. It was a rampant rumor in the ancient world, whispered in the halls of power even as Alexander's body was being prepared for burial. Antipater's motivations were rooted in pure political survival. For years, he had been the loyal steward, holding the Macedonian homeland together while Alexander conquered the east. But by 323 BC, that loyalty was fraying dangerously. Alexander had grown increasingly suspicious of the old general's power and influence. He had even sent orders for Antipater to be replaced and to journey to Babylon, a command that to any seasoned politician would have sounded less like a reassignment and more like a death sentence. For a man of Antipater's stature, arriving at the court of an increasingly paranoid and absolute monarch could easily mean execution without trial. Eliminating Alexander first wasn't just an act of ambition. From his perspective, it may have been an act of self-defense, a desperate move to preempt his own downfall. This is where his sons enter the picture, providing the crucial link to turn motive into action. Cassander, who would later become a king himself, had recently arrived in Babylon. The ancient historian Plutarch records a telling story of their first meeting, describing how Cassander, upon seeing Persian courtiers performing the ritual of proskynesis, bowing before Alexander as if to a god, could not suppress a laugh. Alexander, infuriated by this mockery of his new royal customs, reportedly flew into a rage, grabbing Cassander by the hair and dashing his head against a wall. This wasn't just a petty squabble, it was a profound and public humiliation from a king who was clearly shedding his Macedonian identity for that of an Eastern despot. For Cassander, this personal insult, combined with the imminent threat to his father's life and his family's power, would have provided a powerful incentive for revenge. The most critical piece of the puzzle, however, was his younger brother, Iolaus. Iolaus wasn't just a random courtier, he held one of the most trusted positions in the entire empire. He was Alexander's official cup-bearer. This role granted him intimate, unsupervised access to the king's food and drink. If a poison plot were to be hatched, Iolaus was the ideal inside man, the one person who could bypass tasters and security with ease. The ancient sources directly implicate him, suggesting the poison was concealed in the wine and that Iolaus was the one who served it during the fateful drinking party at the home of Medius of Larissa, who was himself a close associate of the family. This isn't a case of circumstantial evidence. It points to a direct chain of command. Antipater provides the political motive and likely the order from Macedon. Cassander facilitates the plan on the ground in Babylon, and Iolaus, with his unique access, executes it. Their opportunity was perfect. The endless rounds of feasting in Babylon provided a chaotic and very public cover for a discreet assassination. In the loud, wine-soaked atmosphere of a symposium, with dozens of cups being poured and passed around, a single poisoned serving could easily be lost in the revelry. The method proposed using a poisoned wine cooler is particularly cunning. If the inside of the vessel was treated with a toxic substance, the poison would slowly leach into the wine over the course of the evening. The first few cups might be harmless, but as the king, the guest of honor, continued to drink from the same crater, he would consume a progressively more concentrated and lethal dose. This would explain why Alexander was the only one to fall so violently ill, while others at the same feast remained unaffected. It was a sophisticated, coldly calculated act that exploited the very rituals of hospitality and celebration. But beyond the whispers of poison and the theories of infection, there is another compelling explanation rooted not in conspiracy or contagion, but in Alexander's own well-documented lifestyle. The conqueror was famous for his ability to outdrink nearly everyone in his court, a trait celebrated in Macedonian culture as a sign of strength and virility. The endless rounds of feasting in Babylon weren't an anomaly. They were the culmination of a lifetime of heavy consumption. This opens the door to a third major theory, that Alexander the Great was ultimately killed by the very thing he believed showcased his power: alcohol. The ancient sources are filled with accounts of his prodigious drinking. Plutarch, while attempting to defend Alexander's character, still recounts legendary symposia that lasted through the night, with the king matching his companions cup for cup. The most famous of these is the drinking contest at Maracanda, where participants were said to have consumed an astonishing amount of unmixed wine. The winner, a soldier named Promachus, drank the equivalent of 13 liters before dying shortly after, along with 40 other attendees who also perished from alcohol poisoning. Alexander himself nearly died on that occasion, requiring medical intervention to save his life. This wasn't a one-time binge, it was a pattern of behavior that placed immense, repeated stress on his body. This history makes the theory of an alcohol-related collapse highly plausible. Modern medical experts have proposed that Alexander could have suffered from acute pancreatitis, a severe inflammation of the pancreas often triggered by a massive intake of alcohol. The symptoms align terrifyingly well with the ancient descriptions. Acute pancreatitis causes an intense, stabbing pain in the upper abdomen, exactly like being struck by a spear. This is followed by a high fever, rapid pulse, nausea, and a general state of shock that leads to profound weakness. The condition can deteriorate swiftly into multi-organ failure and death, especially without modern medical intervention, perfectly mirroring Alexander's 2-week decline. Another possibility is acute alcoholic hepatitis, a sudden inflammation of the liver caused by binge drinking. This condition can also produce a high fever, severe abdominal pain, jaundice, and rapid mental confusion or lethargy. Given the relentless schedule of feasting in his final days, Alexander's liver could have simply reached a tipping point, overwhelmed by a final, fatal onslaught of alcohol that it could no longer process. His body, already weakened by years of campaigning, battle wounds, and previous bouts of illness, may have had no reserves left to fight this internal crisis. What makes this theory so powerful is its tragic irony. The cultural practice that cemented his bonds with his companions, the shared, heavy drinking that was a cornerstone of Macedonian military camaraderie, may have been the very thing that destroyed him. He wasn't assassinated by a rival, and he didn't fall to a foreign plague. Instead, he could have been a victim of his own hubris, of a belief that his superhuman endurance extended to every aspect of his life, including his capacity for wine. This narrative transforms his death from a political murder or a random infection into a personal tragedy, a slow-motion consequence of the lifestyle that helped forge his legendary status. It serves as a stark, ancient reminder that even the greatest of men are bound by the limits of their own biology. To truly understand this theory, we must step away from our modern perspective and immerse ourselves in the brutal, honor-driven world of ancient Macedonia. For Alexander and his companions, heavy drinking was far more than a social pastime. It was a vital component of their identity, a rigorous test of strength and endurance deeply embedded in their warrior culture. In the harsh climate of the Balkan highlands, where weakness was despised and physical prowess was paramount, the ability to hold one's liquor was a direct measure of a man's character. A Macedonian king was expected to lead not only in battle and strategy but also at the symposium, sharing wine with his companions as a powerful bond of trust and equality. This wasn't about mere indulgence, it was a performance of masculinity and resilience, a way to prove that one could withstand any challenge, whether from a Persian spear or an overflowing cup of strong, unmixed wine. The most notorious example of this culture pushed to its lethal extreme occurred years before Babylon, at a place called Marakanda. Following a difficult campaign, Alexander and his army were blowing off steam with a grand celebration. The event escalated into a formal drinking contest, a test of sheer endurance with unimaginable stakes. The historical accounts state that the participants were competing to see who could consume the most wine from a large ceremonial cup known as a kylix. The soldier who won this brutal contest was a man named Promachus. His victory came at the ultimate price. He drank an estimated 13 liters of unmixed wine and died shortly thereafter, along with 41 other soldiers who also succumbed to alcohol poisoning that night. Alexander himself nearly died, only surviving after his physicians administered strong emetics to purge the poison from his system. This story is not a vague legend. It's a stark historical record that illustrates a cultural environment where celebrating with the king could literally be a death sentence. This pattern of extreme consumption wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout his life, Alexander repeatedly engaged in these marathon drinking sessions. After the traumatic death of his close friend Cleitus, whom Alexander murdered in a drunken rage, the king fell into a state of such profound grief and guilt that he refused food and water for 3 days. How did he finally break this fast? Not with a light meal, but with another heavy bout of drinking, attempting to drown his sorrows in wine. This cycle of using alcohol to celebrate victory, to mourn loss, and to bond with his inner circle placed an incredible cumulative strain on his body. Each major binge was like a hammer blow to his internal organs, particularly his liver and pancreas, weakening his system over years of campaigning. By the time he reached Babylon in 323 BC, Alexander's body was likely a shadow of its former resilient self. He was only 32, but he had lived a lifetime of extreme physical and psychological stress. He had suffered a pierced lung in India, nearly drowning in a desert storm, and endured multiple battlefield wounds and bouts of illness, including a probable case of malaria that left him weak and feverish for days. His liver, constantly processing massive quantities of alcohol to keep up with his lifestyle, would have been particularly vulnerable. Modern hepatology tells us that repeated episodes of heavy drinking can lead to a condition called alcoholic fatty liver disease, which inflames and scars the organ, impairing its function and making it susceptible to a sudden final collapse. When we view his final days through this lens, the feasting in Babylon becomes the final, catastrophic stressor on an already overburdened system. The theory suggests that his body didn't need a poison or a new infection to fail. It simply reached its breaking point. The series of lavish banquets, each with their rounds of strong wine, could have triggered a final, fatal episode of acute alcoholic hepatitis or pancreatitis. The symptoms describe the sudden, spear-like abdominal pain, the raging fever, the rapid descent into weakness and silence are textbook indicators of these alcohol-induced crises. His physicians, armed only with the limited medical knowledge of their time, would have been powerless to stop the internal inflammation and organ failure. In this tragic scenario, Alexander the Great was not murdered by a rival or struck down by a random bacterium. He was ultimately betrayed by the very traditions that defined his kingship, a casualty of the toxic culture of excess that he believed cemented his bond with his men and proved his own invincibility. Yet another formidable natural enemy emerges from the historical evidence, one that Alexander would have encountered repeatedly in his conquests: malaria. This theory proposes that the king was not struck by a new illness in Babylon, but was instead felled by a silent, dormant foe that had been lurking in his bloodstream for years, waiting for a moment of weakness to launch its final, fatal assault. The ancient descriptions of his fever are particularly telling. They don't describe a constant, unbroken heat, but rather a fever that spiked and then broke, only to return again with a vengeance. This cyclical pattern of chills, sweating, and high temperature is the classic signature of malaria, a disease caused by a parasite that invades red blood cells, multiplies, and then bursts them open in synchronized waves, each release triggering another brutal episode of fever. Alexander's military campaigns had taken him straight through some of the most malaria-ridden regions in the ancient world. He had spent significant time in the swampy, mosquito-infested lowlands of Mesopotamia and the river deltas of India. In these areas, the Anopheles mosquito, the primary vector for the malaria parasite, would have been rampant. It takes just one bite from an infected mosquito to transmit the parasites, which then travel to the liver to mature before entering the bloodstream. A person can be infected and carry the parasite for months or even years without showing severe symptoms, experiencing only occasional, mild fevers that might be mistaken for exhaustion or a common chill. For a soldier constantly on the move, such minor complaints would have been ignored, a mere inconvenience on the path to glory. The most deadly form of malaria is caused by the Plasmodium falciparum parasite, and its effects are devastating. It can cause severe anemia from the destruction of red blood cells, cerebral malaria leading to coma, and organ failure. The cyclical nature of the fever, often recurring every 2 or 3 days, aligns with the reproductive cycle of different malaria parasites. The key to this theory lies in the concept of relapse. Even if Alexander had contracted malaria years earlier, the parasite can remain dormant in the liver. Periods of extreme physical stress, other illnesses, or a weakened immune system can trigger a relapse, causing a full-blown and potentially fatal malarial crisis. The relentless feasting and drinking in Babylon, combined with the cumulative exhaustion of a decade of campaigning, could have provided the perfect trigger for such a relapse, awakening a sleeping giant within him. This theory gains further traction from Alexander's own medical history. During his campaigns, he suffered several documented episodes of sudden, debilitating illness. Most notably, after a forced march through difficult terrain and a swim in the icy waters of the river Cydnus in what is now Turkey, he collapsed with a high fever that left him near death for days. Some historians and medical experts have retrospectively diagnosed this particular illness as malaria. If that were true, it would mean the parasite was already present in his body long before he reached Babylon. Each subsequent period of stress or illness could have weakened his resistance, making each relapse more severe than the last. His final illness, then, wouldn't be a new infection but the culmination of a long, slow battle his body was slowly losing. The environment of Babylon itself, while often cited for typhoid, was also a perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. The city was crisscrossed by canals from the Euphrates River, and the surrounding marshes would have provided ideal conditions for mosquitoes to thrive, especially in the spring when Alexander arrived. A fresh bite in Babylon could have delivered a new, overwhelming dose of the parasite, or simply been the environmental trigger that sparked a catastrophic relapse from an old infection. His physicians, of course, would have had no concept of parasites or mosquitoes as vectors. Their treatments, which may have included bloodletting, would have only weakened him further, accelerating the disease's deadly course. In this light, Alexander's death becomes a tragic intersection of biology and history, a conqueror brought down not by armies, but by one of the oldest and most persistent killers of humanity, a threat as small as a mosquito and as vast as his own empire. To understand how malaria could have been the silent killer, we need to appreciate just how common this scourge was in the ancient world, particularly in the regions Alexander conquered. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was a cradle of civilization but also a perfect breeding ground for disease. The sophisticated irrigation systems that made agriculture possible also created endless pockets of stagnant water, ideal nurseries for the Anopheles mosquitoes that carry the malaria parasite. Historical records from the region, including ancient Mesopotamian medical texts, describe illnesses featuring recurring fevers and enlarged spleens, which modern experts widely interpret as clear descriptions of malaria. For the people living there, these marsh fevers were a dreaded and regular part of life, a seasonal danger they had no way of preventing or truly understanding. This environment was a death trap for any foreign army, and Alexander's forces were no exception. Military historians and epidemiologists studying the campaign have noticed a pattern of illness that followed his troops, particularly through low-lying and swampy areas. The army's sheer size, often estimated at over 50,000 men, would have created massive temporary settlements with poor sanitation, drawing mosquitoes in huge numbers and leading to widespread outbreaks. It's highly probable that a significant portion of his soldiers carried the parasite, experiencing mild or severe symptoms that would have sapped the army's strength long before any battle began. Alexander, constantly moving among his men and exposed to the same conditions, would have been at tremendous risk of repeated infections throughout his years of campaigning. This theory gained significant traction in the 20th century when epidemiologists began to apply modern disease modeling to ancient historical events. They weren't just looking at Alexander's case in isolation, they were examining the broader health of his army. The logs of military movements show that the army's progress was sometimes halted not by enemy forces, but by widespread sickness, often occurring after traversing wet, riverine terrain. These patterns strongly suggest that malaria was a constant, draining presence within the ranks, a hidden enemy that caused more casualties than any Persian army. For a commander sharing every hardship with his troops, the statistical probability of Alexander contracting the disease at some point was exceptionally high. When we look at the medical knowledge of the time, the mystery deepens. Ancient physicians, for all their skill, had no concept of microorganisms or parasites. They attributed fevers to an imbalance of bodily humors or to bad air, which is actually the root of the word malaria from the Italian molla area. Their treatments, while sometimes innovative, were often harmful by modern standards. A standard remedy for a high fever was bloodletting, the very last thing a person suffering from malaria-induced anemia would need. They might also prescribe purgatives or emetics, further dehydrating a patient who was already dangerously weak. If Alexander was indeed in the throes of a severe malarial relapse, the well-intentioned efforts of his personal physician, Philip the Acarnanian, could have unintentionally hastened his decline by further weakening his body's already failing systems. The malaria theory, then, presents a profoundly historical and tragic narrative. It doesn't require a shadowy conspiracy or a single catastrophic binge. Instead, it paints a picture of a man whose incredible luck finally ran out, After a decade of pushing his body to the absolute limit, during battle wounds, starvation, thirst, and exposure, his immune system was undoubtedly compromised. The lavish feasting in Babylon, rather than being the direct cause, may have been the final straw, a period of intense physical stress that allowed a dormant parasite, acquired years earlier in some distant marsh, to erupt with fatal force. His death becomes a story of a conqueror laid low by the microscopic realities of the world he sought to rule, a reminder that nature itself was the one enemy he could not defeat. Amidst the long-standing debates over poison and ancient plagues, a far more contemporary and surprising suspect entered the scene in the late 1990s. This theory didn't emerge from a classicist's dusty library, but from the collaboration of a renowned epidemiologist and a virologist who applied modern disease detective work to an ancient mystery. Dr. John Marr and Dr. Charles Kalischer put forward a fascinating and controversial proposal that Alexander the Great may have been killed by the West Nile virus. This hypothesis immediately stands out because it feels so modern. West Nile only entered the public consciousness in the Western world after a significant outbreak in New York City in 1999. The idea that a virus we currently associate with mosquitoes in North America could have felled a conqueror in ancient Babylon is a startling connection across millennia. But Dr. Marr and Dr. Kalischer argued that the virus has likely existed for centuries in the Eastern Hemisphere, and they built their case by meticulously matching Alexander's documented symptoms to the known progression of West Nile encephalitis. The most compelling piece of this theory is the striking description of Alexander's mental state during his illness. The ancient sources are unanimous on one point. Even as his body failed him, his mind remained clear and lucid almost to the very end. This is a hallmark of West Nile neuroinvasive disease. Unlike many other severe infections that cause delirium or confusion early on, West Nile virus can preserve a patient's cognitive functions while attacking the brainstem and the central nervous system, leading to a specific kind of paralysis and extreme muscle weakness. This could perfectly explain the historical accounts that emphasize Alexander's awareness even as he lost the ability to speak or move. Furthermore, the timeline of his illness fits the known incubation and progression of West Nile. After the initial mosquito bite, it takes between 2 to 14 days for symptoms to appear. Alexander could have been infected well before his final feast, with the virus quietly multiplying in his system. The onset would then begin with a high fever, headaches, and body aches symptoms that align with the initial phase of his sickness. As the neuroinvasive phase took hold, it would cause the severe weakness, the loss of speech, and the eventual respiratory failure that characterized his final days. This precise, staged progression makes a powerful case for the virus being the culprit. The environment of Babylon itself provides a plausible backdrop for this theory. The city, with its complex network of canals from the Euphrates River and its surrounding marshes, would have been an ideal habitat for Culex mosquitoes, the primary vector for the West Nile virus. The springtime, when Alexander arrived, is often peak mosquito season in such climates. The virus also utilizes birds as its primary host, and Babylon was a bustling crossroads on ancient migratory bird routes. A mosquito could have bitten an infected bird and then bitten the king, setting the tragic sequence in motion. This ecological explanation grounds the theory in the very real conditions of the time and place. However, this modern hypothesis faces significant challenges from critics. One major objection is the lack of reported mass illness. West Nile virus outbreaks, even ancient ones, would likely not have been isolated events. The virus typically causes a spectrum of illness in a population, with many people experiencing mild or no symptoms, but a recognizable percentage developing severe neurological disease. If a West Nile outbreak was severe enough to kill the king, historians argue, would there not be some record of a wider sickness affecting his companions or the city's population? The ancient sources are silent on this point, focusing solely on the king's illness, which suggests a uniquely targeted affliction rather than a community-wide epidemic. This silence in the historical record is a substantial hurdle. While we can't expect ancient historians to have diagnosed a viral outbreak, they were meticulous in recording omens, plagues, and unusual events. A widespread sickness striking Babylon at the same time as the king's death would have been noted as a significant and likely ominous occurrence. Its absence doesn't completely disprove the theory, but it does weaken its foundation, leaving room for doubt and allowing other, more targeted explanations like poison or a personalized illness like pancreatitis to maintain their credibility. The mystery endures because each theory, no matter how compelling, contains a piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit. In a fascinating twist of modern medical detective work, a bold new theory emerged in 2019 that reframes the entire mystery not as a poison plot or common infection, but as a rare neurological disorder. Dr. Catherine Hall, a senior clinical lecturer at the University of Otago in New Zealand, proposed that Alexander the Great might have succumbed to Guillain-Barré syndrome, a condition that attacks the body's nervous system. This idea didn't just add another suspect to the list, it fundamentally challenged how we interpret the ancient accounts of his death, particularly one baffling detail that other theories struggled to explain: how a man could be completely paralyzed and unable to speak, yet remain entirely mentally aware until his final breath. Guillain-Barré syndrome, or GBS, is an autoimmune disorder where the body's own immune system mistakenly attacks the peripheral nerves. This damage disrupts the signals traveling between the brain and the muscles, leading to rapidly worsening muscle weakness that often begins in the legs and arms before spreading inward. In its most severe form, it can cause near-total paralysis, including the muscles required for breathing and speaking. Crucially, and this is the cornerstone of Dr. Hall's argument, the disease typically leaves the patient's cognitive functions completely untouched. A person with advanced GBS can be fully conscious, aware of their surroundings, and able to think clearly, yet be trapped inside a body that no longer responds to their commands. This creates a terrifying locked-in state, which aligns almost perfectly with the historical descriptions of Alexander's final days. Dr. Hall's analysis hinges on a meticulous re-examination of those ancient sources. She points out that the accounts consistently emphasize Alexander's preserved mental acuity. Plutarch, for instance, notes that even when he was too weak to speak, Alexander could still acknowledge his generals with a movement of his eyes or a slight gesture. This level of awareness is incredibly difficult to reconcile with the high fevers and delirium associated with infections like typhoid or malaria, or the violent agony of many poisons. Those conditions typically cloud the mind. GBS, by contrast, famously spares it. This theory elegantly solves the puzzle of his lucidity, suggesting he wasn't fading in and out of consciousness but was frighteningly present for his own physical decline. The proposed trigger for this autoimmune reaction adds another layer of compelling context. GBS is frequently preceded by a common bacterial or viral infection, often a simple case of food poisoning or a bout of campylobacteriosis from undercooked poultry or contaminated water. Given the endless rounds of feasting in Babylon, with food prepared under less than sanitary conditions, it is entirely plausible that Alexander contracted a common gastrointestinal infection in the days before his collapse. His immune system would have mounted a response to fight off the infection, but in a tragic misfire, it then turned on his own nerve cells, initiating the catastrophic neurological cascade of GBS. This means the initial stomach pain reported after the drinking party wasn't from a poison or the GBS itself, but from the common infection that sparked it all. This theory also offers a startling new interpretation of one of the most debated pieces of evidence: the claim that Alexander's body did not show signs of decomposition for several days after his death. Ancient historians like Plutarch report this as a miraculous sign of his divinity. Dr. Hall, however, provides a scientific explanation. In cases of severe GBS, the paralysis can affect the muscles used for breathing, leading to death from respiratory failure. In this state, the heart may continue to beat weakly for some time after breathing becomes imperceptible. To an ancient observer without modern medical monitoring equipment, a person in this state might genuinely appear dead cold, motionless, and not breathing, while a faint pulse and minimal metabolic activity persist. What was seen as a supernatural preservation of his body could have simply been a misdiagnosis of death at a time when the signs were poorly understood. While this neurological theory is brilliant in its explanatory power, it is not without its own set of critics. Some medical historians argue that GBS, while known to have existed in the ancient world, is an exceptionally rare condition. They question the statistical likelihood of it striking down history's most famous conqueror precisely at the moment of peak political tension. Furthermore, the classic progression of GBS often includes symptoms like tingling or pins and needles in the extremities, a detail absent from the ancient accounts. However, defenders of the theory counter that such specific sensory details are exactly the kind of nuance that might be omitted from historical records focused on the king's dramatic weakness and fever, rather than a comprehensive medical chart. Dr. Hall's Guillain-Barré theory ultimately forces us to look at Alexander's death through a completely different lens. It moves the conversation away from external culprits, a poisoner's vial or a mosquito's bite, and toward a tragic internal malfunction of his own biology. It paints a picture not of a king murdered by his enemies, but of a man betrayed by his own immune system, a victim of a random and devastating medical event. This explanation doesn't require a conspiracy, it only requires bad luck. In doing so, it provides one of the most humane and clinically coherent narratives for his suffering, solving the ancient riddle of the conqueror's clear mind imprisoned within a failing body. The moment Alexander drew his last breath, the fragile unity of his colossal empire shattered instantly. There was no smooth transition of power, no respected heir ready to step into the conqueror's sandals. Instead, a terrifying power vacuum erupted in the heart of Babylon, plunging the known world into a maelstrom of ambition, suspicion, and raw violence. The king's senior generals, known to history as the Diadochi or successors, found themselves in a room together not as brothers in arms, but as rivals staring across the body of the only man who had ever been able to command their loyalty. The question wasn't just who would lead, it was whether the empire could even survive as a single entity. The first and most pressing issue was the succession. Alexander's wife, Roxana, was pregnant, but the sex of the child was unknown. His half-brother, Philippa Hideous, was considered mentally unfit to rule. This left the generals with an impossible choice: wait for a potential heir to be born, or immediately crown a figurehead they could control. They chose a bizarre and unstable compromise, nominally granting joint kingship to the unborn child, who would become Alexander IV, and the unfit Hideous. This was a clear signal that real power would not reside with the kings, but with the generals who ruled in their name. The empire, in effect, became a prize to be divided among the strongest. And the division began almost immediately. What followed was a frantic and brutal carve-up of the greatest territory the ancient world had ever seen. Perdiccas, the most senior cavalry commander, took control of the central regency, positioning himself as the guardian of the royal family. Ptolemy secured the rich and strategically vital province of Egypt. Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, took a powerful satrapy in Asia Minor. Seleucus gained Babylon, Lysimachus received Thrace, and Antipater retained control of Macedon and Greece. This initial settlement, known as the Partition of Babylon, was never intended to be permanent. It was a tense and temporary truce, a map drawn on sand just before the tide came in. The atmosphere was so thick with suspicion that it quickly turned lethal. Anyone perceived as a threat to this fragile new order was eliminated. Alexander's loyal secretary, Eumenes, was immediately sidelined. More horrifically, the king's inner circle moved with chilling speed to purge his family. Within a few years, both his wife Roxana and his young son, Alexander IV, were murdered, extinguishing the Argead bloodline that had ruled Macedon for centuries. His mother, Olympias, met a similar fate. These were not random acts of violence, they were calculated political assassinations designed to remove any figurehead around which opposition could coalesce, ensuring that the Diadochi alone would shape the future. The uncertainty surrounding Alexander's own death became a potent weapon in these early struggles. The lingering whisper of poison provided a perfect pretext for accusation and revenge. Those who favored the natural causes narrative, often the ones in power, used it to present themselves as legitimate stewards of his legacy. Those who were out of favor or who sought to discredit their rivals loudly championed the assassination theory, painting their enemies as treacherous regicides. The mystery was no longer just a historical question. It was active, live ammunition in a propaganda war, used to justify alliances, betrayals, and open conflict. This initial breakdown of trust guaranteed that the settlement would not hold. Within just 2 years, the first of the wars of the Diadochi erupted, a sprawling series of conflicts that would rage for nearly 4 decades. The battle lines were constantly shifting as alliances formed and shattered with breathtaking speed. Former comrades became bitter enemies, and the dream of a unified empire died on 100 different battlefields from the Aegean Sea to the banks of the Indus. The world Alexander had forged through conquest was now being torn apart by the very men who had helped him build it, their ambitions unleashed by the sudden absence of the one man who could keep them in check. The shocking and unresolved nature of his death didn't just create a power vacuum, it poured gasoline on the fire of human ambition, ensuring that the chaos he left behind would define the next century. Amidst the chaos and the political scheming that followed his death, one detail from the ancient accounts stands out as particularly bizarre and inexplicable, a detail that has fueled speculation for over 2 millennia. Multiple sources, including Plutarch, report that Alexander's body did not show any signs of decomposition for a full 6 days after he was declared dead. In the hot, humid climate of Babylon, such a phenomenon would have been nothing short of miraculous, instantly feeding the narrative that he was not a mere mortal but a god. For ancient historians, this was a powerful sign of his divinity. For modern investigators, however, it is either a crucial forensic clue or one of history's most persistent red herrings. If we take this account at face value, it demands a scientific explanation, and one compelling theory points directly to certain poisons. Some toxic substances, particularly those derived from plants, are known to have preservative qualities that can slow down the natural process of decay. The most frequently suggested culprit in this scenario is white hellebore, a poison we've already discussed for its violent symptomatic fit. Beyond its horrific effects on a living person, hellebore contains compounds that are antibacterial and can inhibit the growth of the microorganisms responsible for decomposition. If a massive, lethal dose was indeed administered to Alexander, it could have saturated his tissues, acting as a natural embalming agent and preserving his body for an unnaturally long period. This would create the exact phenomenon described by the ancient sources, turning a detail meant to signify divinity into potential evidence of a carefully planned assassination. Yet, we must approach this startling claim with a heavy dose of historical and scientific skepticism. The account of the incorruptible body comes from sources written centuries after the fact, by authors deeply influenced by the powerful legend Alexander had become. By the time Plutarch was writing, Alexander was less a historical figure and more a mythological archetype, a superhuman hero whose life and death were expected to be accompanied by supernatural signs. The story of his preserved body fits perfectly into this literary tradition, a common trope used to signify the passing of a great and holy figure. It's entirely possible that this detail was not a factual medical observation but a symbolic literary device, exaggerated or invented entirely to reinforce his godlike status for a Roman audience that expected such tales. There's also a more tragic, mundane possibility that bridges the gap between miracle and murder. Let's return to the Guillain-Barré syndrome theory proposed by Dr. Catherine Hall. She offers a fascinating medical explanation that requires no poison and no divine intervention. In the most severe cases of GBS, the paralysis can lead to a state where a patient's breathing becomes so shallow and imperceptible that, without modern medical monitoring, they could be mistakenly declared dead. Their heart might still be beating faintly, and their metabolic processes slowed to an absolute minimum, creating the illusion of a preserved corpse. What the ancient observers interpreted as a miraculous lack of decay could have simply been a catastrophic misdiagnosis of death. Alexander may have been lying in state, fully conscious and aware but completely paralyzed for those 6 days, eventually succumbing to dehydration or full respiratory failure. This interpretation is perhaps the most haunting of all, transforming a divine miracle into a profound human tragedy. The truth is, we will likely never know with certainty what caused this strange phenomenon. The story of Alexander's preserved body remains the ultimate Rorschach test for this mystery. If you believe he was poisoned, it's a compelling piece of forensic evidence that points to a specific type of toxin. If you believe his death was natural, it's either a literary exaggeration or a tragic medical misunderstanding. This single, strange detail encapsulates the entire challenge of investigating Alexander's death. Every piece of evidence can be read in multiple ways. Every clue can be either a key to the truth or a distraction planted by history itself. It reminds us that we are not just sifting through facts, but through layers of legend, politics, and human hope that have accumulated over 23 centuries. This entire investigation hinges on a fundamental and frustrating problem. We are trying to solve a crime without any of the original case files. The truly contemporary accounts of Alexander's life and death, the ones written by men who actually marched with him, are all lost to history. These were the eyewitness testimonies, the official campaign journals, the biographies penned by his trusted generals like Ptolemy and Nearchus. They vanished centuries ago, likely decaying into dust or lost in the great fire that consumed the library of Alexandria. What we are left with are not the primary sources, but distant echoes written 3, 4, even 500 years after the fact by Roman-era authors like Arrian, Plutarch, and Quintus Curtius Rufus. These later historians were working with second- and third-hand information, sifting through the fragments of those original accounts that had survived. They were not neutral observers, they were men of their own time, often writing with specific moral or political lessons in mind for a Roman audience. Plutarch, for instance, was less concerned with strict historical accuracy and more interested in using Alexander's life as a series of moral anecdotes about virtue, vice, and the nature of power. This means the details of his death were often filtered through a lens of what made a good story or a compelling character lesson, not necessarily what forensically happened in that Babylonian palace. The most tantalizing and controversial of these lost sources is the so-called royal journal or ephemerides. Several ancient authors claim this court diary offered a detailed, almost hour-by-hour account of Alexander's final days, describing his fevers, his baths, and his moments of lucidity. On the surface, this journal presents a straightforward story of a natural, if swift, illness. But many modern scholars strongly suspect this document was a sophisticated forgery, fabricated in the immediate aftermath of the king's death. The likely culprits, the very successors who had the most to gain from quashing rumors of assassination, such as Antipater or his son Cassander, imagine the motive. If whispers of poison were already circulating among the troops and the generals, the most powerful men in the room needed an official, irrefutable narrative to ensure their own survival and legitimize their claim to power. What better way to do that than to produce a meticulously detailed court diary, an ostensibly objective log that stated day by day that the king simply fell sick and died? It was the perfect piece of ancient propaganda designed to control the story from the very beginning. The existence of this potentially fabricated journal doesn't just muddy the waters, it actively poisons the well of historical evidence, making it nearly impossible to trust the most detailed account we have of his final days. This manipulation of the narrative was not a one-time event. It was a constant, ongoing process by Alexander's warring successors. Each of the Diadochi had a powerful vested interest in shaping the story of the king's death to suit their own political ambitions. A general like Ptolemy, who went on to found a stable and long-lasting dynasty in Egypt, had every reason to promote a narrative of natural causes, portraying himself as the loyal steward of Alexander's legacy rather than a potential conspirator, lent crucial legitimacy to his new rule. For him, the official, journal-approved story of a tragic illness was far more useful than a messy, unresolved murder mystery. Conversely, a rival faction might have found it advantageous to keep the poison theory alive, using it as a political weapon to discredit their enemies. By accusing a competitor of regicide, a general could rally support, justify a military campaign, and paint himself as the avenger of the great king's murder. The truth of what actually happened became less important than the political utility of the story. The historical record we inherited is not a pristine transcript of events. It is a battlefield scarred by the propaganda wars of men fighting over the scraps of an empire, each trying to write a version of history that placed them in the most heroic or defensible light. This leaves us in a nearly impossible position as historical detectives. We are sifting through layers of narrative, each one shaped by bias, agenda, and the passage of centuries. We have to read between the lines of Roman moralists, question the authenticity of official diaries, and decode the political motives behind every version of the story. The loss of the primary sources means we are trying to complete a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing, while many of the pieces we do have were deliberately crafted to fit a picture we can no longer see. The mystery of Alexander's death is not just a medical whodunit. It is a profound lesson in how history is written, and more often how it is rewritten by the victors. Imagine if we could bring the full force of 21st century forensic science to bear on this ancient mystery. What if Alexander's tomb had never been lost and his remains were available for modern examination? The investigation would shift from interpreting dusty texts to analyzing physical evidence, and the tools at our disposal would be nothing short of revolutionary. The first and most critical step would be a comprehensive toxicology screening. Modern mass spectrometry can detect the faintest chemical whispers of poison, even after millennia. We could test his hair, which acts as a biological timeline, recording exposure to substances like arsenic or strychnine over the final months of his life. A higher concentration of toxins in the segments of hair closest to the root would be a damning indicator of a gradual, deliberate poisoning. We could also analyze his nails and any surviving soft tissue for a suite of heavy metals, plant-based alkaloids, and bacterial toxins, searching for the chemical signature of a murder that has remained hidden for over 2,000 years. Beyond poisons, DNA analysis would open up an entirely new frontier of investigation. By sequencing Alexander's genome, scientists could search for genetic predispositions to certain conditions. Did he carry a mutation that made him more susceptible to autoimmune disorders like Guillain-Barré syndrome? Was there a markers for a higher risk of pancreatitis, which could have been catastrophically triggered by his heavy drinking? This genetic blueprint could either rule out or lend powerful support to several of the natural causes theories. Furthermore, paleopathologists could examine his skeletal remains and any mummified tissues for direct evidence of disease. High-resolution CT scans could reveal calcified parasites in the gut, evidence of chronic malaria. Microscopic analysis of bone marrow might show changes consistent with long-term anemia, another potential sign of a persistent parasitic infection. Even the condition of his teeth and jaw could provide clues about periods of severe illness or malnutrition during his life. Perhaps the most telling evidence would come from his stomach and intestinal contents, if any had survived the mummification process. The analysis of his gut microbiome could reveal the presence of pathogenic bacteria like Salmonella enterica, which causes typhoid fever. Finding the DNA of this specific bacterium would be as close to a smoking gun as we could get for that particular theory. We could also analyze dental calculus, the hardened plaque on his teeth which traps and preserves DNA from everything a person eats and drinks. This could reveal not only his diet but also evidence of exposure to contaminated water or food sources in the days leading up to his death. However, even with all our advanced technology, the investigation would face immense challenges. The passage of time degrades DNA and organic compounds, making definitive results difficult to obtain. Contamination is a constant threat. Every handler of the remains over the centuries, from ancient priests to modern archaeologists, would leave their own genetic traces behind. Furthermore, any treatments used in his original embalming oils, resins, or other preservatives could interfere with chemical analysis or introduce confounding elements. We might find evidence of multiple factors at play, traces of a common stomach bug that triggered a fatal autoimmune response, or low-level arsenic exposure from his environment that weakened his system before a final, lethal dose was administered. The evidence might not point to a single, clear culprit, but instead paint a complex picture of a body pushed to its absolute limit, making it vulnerable to a final, fatal blow from either nature or a conspirator. The real answer might lie in a tragic combination of factors, a perfect storm of personal excess, political betrayal, and biological misfortune that even our best science could only partially unravel. To truly grasp the peril Alexander faced in his final days, we must step away from the grand palaces and political intrigue and look at the city itself not as a capital of an empire, but as an environment teeming with invisible threats. Babylon, for all its legendary beauty and advanced engineering, was a death trap of microbial life. The very features that made it a marvel of the ancient world also made it a perfect breeding ground for disease. The city's lifeblood was the Euphrates River, a mighty waterway that snaked through its center. While this provided vital irrigation for the famous Hanging Gardens and a convenient transport route, it was also the city's main sewer. Human waste, animal carcasses, and all manner of refuse were routinely dumped into the canals that fed from the river, creating a constant cycle of contamination where the water used for drinking, cooking, and bathing was also the water that carried away the city's filth. The sanitation challenges were overwhelming for a population of its size. Babylon was a dense, crowded metropolis, swollen further by the presence of Alexander's massive army and its attendant camp followers. The common practice of drawing drinking water directly from the Euphrates or its network of canals meant that waterborne illnesses were not just possible, they were a constant daily reality. In the bustling lower city, away from the grandeur of the royal quarters, open sewers and contaminated public wells would have been standard. For a king participating in large public feasts, the risk was immense. The kitchens preparing food for these lavish events would have been relying on this same polluted water supply to wash vegetables, prepare stews, and dilute wine, creating countless opportunities for pathogens to find their way onto the royal plate and into the royal cup. This environment made certain diseases endemic, meaning they were permanently established in the population. Typhoid fever caused by the Salmonella typhi bacteria would have been a prime candidate, spreading rapidly through contaminated water or food handled by an infected person. The symptoms are sustained high fever, abdominal pain, and progressive weakness match the historical descriptions of Alexander's illness with unsettling precision. Similarly, dysentery, in both its bacterial and amoebic forms, would have been a common scourge, causing severe dehydration and debilitating intestinal cramping that could easily overwhelm a person's constitution. But the threats weren't only in the water. The climate and geography of the region presented another formidable vector for disease: mosquitoes. The marshy lands surrounding the Euphrates created an ideal habitat for these insects, particularly in the warmer months. This puts two major theories squarely on the table. Malaria, a disease well documented in ancient Mesopotamia, was spread by the Anopheles mosquito. Its cyclical fevers, chills, and sweats could explain the reports of Alexander's fever spiking and breaking. Even if he had contracted malaria years earlier on campaign, the stress of his lifestyle and a new mosquito bite in Babylon could have triggered a devastating relapse. Furthermore, the presence of Culex mosquitoes opens the door to the more modern theory of West Nile virus, which can cause severe neurological symptoms, including paralysis and high fever, while leaving the mind lucid, another detail that aligns with the accounts of Alexander's awareness during his physical decline. The spring season when Alexander arrived would have been a peak time for mosquito activity, making a bite from an infected insect a simple, random, and tragically effective killer. Therefore, when we assess the Babylonian context, we see that Alexander wasn't just a king in a palace. He was a human being immersed in a petri dish of pathogens. Whether the culprit was a bacterium in his water, a parasite in his blood, or a virus transmitted by a mosquito, the environment itself was a silent, hostile force. His immense power and wealth could not shield him from the microscopic realities of the ancient world. This perspective doesn't necessarily rule out poison or an alcohol-related collapse, but it powerfully frames his death within a setting where a fatal illness was not a bizarre anomaly, but a tragically common occurrence. The greatest conqueror the world had ever known was ultimately vulnerable to the same mundane dangers that threatened the most common soldier in his ranks. To understand the final collapse of Alexander the Great, we must look beyond the fevers of Babylon and consider the tremendous physical toll his body had already endured. This was not a healthy man struck down by a single mysterious illness. This was a body pushed far beyond its limits, a system already running on fumes long before that final drinking party. His entire adult life was a relentless marathon of combat, deprivation, and recovery, each episode chipping away at his legendary resilience and leaving him profoundly vulnerable. The most visible evidence of this accumulated damage comes from the battlefield. Alexander didn't command his armies from a safe hilltop. He led from the very front, a habit that placed him in mortal danger time and again. At the Granicus River, in the very first major battle of his Persian campaign, a Persian nobleman named Spithridates swung a battle axe at Alexander's head with enough force to cleave his helmet and slice into his scalp, nearly killing him on the spot. Had it not been for the quick intervention of his friend Cleitus, who severed the Persian's arm, history would have ended there. This was more than a close call. It was a catastrophic head wound that would have left a lesser man with lasting neurological effects if he survived at all. Even more severe was the injury he suffered years later during the brutal siege of the Malian town in India. In a moment of furious impulse, Alexander scaled the enemy wall and leaped into the fortified city alone, facing a horde of Indian soldiers. An Indian archer fired a long bamboo arrow that struck the king in the chest, piercing his lung. The ancient sources describe the wound in horrifying detail. Air and blood hissed from the puncture, and his physicians feared any attempt to remove the arrowhead would cause him to bleed out immediately. He eventually survived, but a pierced lung is a life-altering injury. It can lead to permanent reduced lung capacity, a susceptibility to respiratory infections and chronic pain, a massive handicap for a man living a life of constant physical exertion. Beyond these dramatic wounds, his body was a map of lesser injuries. He was struck by stones that concussed him, by swords that left deep gashes, and by the general brutality of ancient combat. But the damage wasn't only external. His campaigns subjected him to extreme environmental hardships that would have weakened anyone's constitution. He forced his army through the blistering heat of the Gedrosian desert, where water was scarce and men dropped dead from thirst and heatstroke. He marched through the frozen passes of the Hindu Kush, where frostbite was a constant threat. He waded through the swampy, disease-ridden marshes of Mesopotamia. This cycle of extreme heat, extreme cold, dehydration, and exhaustion is a recipe for a compromised immune system, making the body a perfect target for opportunistic infections. His medical history is also punctuated by several serious, unexplained illnesses. After swimming in the icy waters of the river Cydnus in Cilicia, he developed a high fever so severe that his physicians despaired of his life. Some historians have retroactively diagnosed this as malaria, suggesting he carried the parasite with him for years. On another occasion, after a period of intense exertion, he fell into a state of such profound exhaustion that he slept for an entire day and night, unable to be woken, worrying his companions that he had slipped into a coma. These were not simple colds, they were major physiological crises that signaled a body under immense and unsustainable strain. When we pull all of this together, the near-fatal head trauma, the pierced lung, the countless lesser wounds, the exposure to harsh climates, and the previous bouts of severe illness, we see a man whose physical reserves were utterly depleted by the age of 32. His body had been asked to recover from too much, too often. His immune system was likely weakened, his organs stressed, his ability to fight off a new infection critically diminished. The Alexander who returned to Babylon was a masterpiece of willpower, but his physical vessel was cracking. This context is crucial. It means that whatever finally killed him, whether it was a common bacterium in the water, a mosquito-borne virus, or a toxic dose of wine, encountered a host who had very little left to fight with. His legendary strength had been spent not in a single moment, but over a decade of superhuman effort, leaving a hollowed-out king vulnerable to a final, fatal blow. The atmosphere at the home of Medius of Larissa that final evening was likely one of boisterous celebration, a familiar scene in the Macedonian court where shared wine cemented bonds of loyalty and proved one's strength. Yet this particular symposium would become the most scrutinized party in history, the pivotal moment where a conqueror in his prime began his swift and shocking collapse. To understand whether this was an innocent farewell feast or a carefully staged assassination, we must reconstruct the guest list, the rituals of drinking, and the sinister opportunities they presented. Medius himself is a figure shrouded in intriguing connections. He was a high-ranking companion of Alexander, a trusted friend, but ancient sources also note his close ties to the powerful family of Antipater, the regent back in Macedon whom Alexander had recently ordered to be replaced. Antipater's son, Cassander, had just arrived in Babylon after a tense encounter with the king, and his younger brother, Iolaus, held the crucial position of Alexander's royal cup-bearer. The presence of these individuals, along with other top generals like Ptolemy, Perdiccas, and Seleucus, transforms this private gathering from a simple party into a meeting of the most powerful and potentially ambitious men in the empire, all sharing wine with the king they served, or perhaps had begun to fear. The drinking itself followed strict Macedonian traditions, rituals that a poisoner could exploit with terrifying precision. Wine was not served from individual bottles, it was mixed with water in a large communal bowl called a crater. A designated cup-bearer, in this case likely Iolaus, would have been responsible for managing this vessel, overseeing the dilution and ensuring the king's cup was always filled. This centralized point of service was the single biggest vulnerability in Alexander's security. If someone wished to poison the king, they wouldn't need to slip something directly into his personal cup under the watchful eyes of everyone present. Instead, they could tamper with the crater itself, a far less conspicuous and much more effective method. This leads to a chillingly plausible method of administration. Imagine a crater whose interior had been pre-treated with a toxic substance, perhaps a paste made from white hellebore or a concentrate of arsenic. As the cold wine was poured into the vessel and sat throughout the evening, it would slowly leach the poison from the sides. The first few cups drawn from the crater might contain only a minuscule, non-lethal dose, but as the party wore on and the crater was refilled, the concentration of poison in the wine at the bottom would become exponentially stronger. As the guest of honor, Alexander would have been served consistently and would have drunk the most, ultimately consuming a massive, fatal dose from the dregs of the poisoned bowl, while others, who drank less, experienced only minor effects. This scenario perfectly explains the otherwise puzzling fact that Alexander was the only one to fall violently ill. If a common tainted dish or a batch of bad wine had been served, we would expect reports of other guests suffering similar, if less severe, symptoms. The silence on this point is deafening. It suggests a targeted attack, one that required intimate knowledge of court rituals and privileged access to the serving ware. Iolaus, as the cup-bearer, had both. He controlled the crater, he served the wine, and he was the brother of a man with a powerful motive to see the king dead. The timing of the illness's onset is another critical clue. The ancient accounts state that the searing abdominal pain struck Alexander shortly after he drained a final, large cup of unmixed wine. This detail is often presented as evidence of his legendary drinking prowess, but it could also mark the moment he consumed the lethal concentrate from the bottom of the vessel. The unmixed wine would have been even more effective at drawing out the last residues of any poison, delivering a pure, potent blast of toxin directly into his system. The reported sensation of being stabbed by a spear could be the acute physical reaction to a devastating alkaloid or corrosive substance hitting his stomach lining. So, was the drinking party at Medius's home a last supper or a poisoning opportunity? The evidence, though circumstantial, paints a compelling picture of the latter. It was a gathering that provided the perfect alibi, a public, celebratory event where any illness could be later attributed to overindulgence or a sudden fever. It placed the king in a relaxed setting where his guard was down, surrounded by the very men who stood to gain the most from his death, and it offered a mechanism for murder that was ingenious, discreet, and almost undetectable, turning a sacred ritual of camaraderie into the ideal weapon for a traitor. This single evening stands as the dark heart of the mystery, a moment where laughter and celebration may have masked one of history's most audacious and successful crimes. This profound uncertainty, this unanswered question at the heart of his story, did not diminish Alexander's legend. It became the very engine that powered it. A clear, natural death would have been an ending, a period at the close of a sentence, but a mystery is an ellipsis, an invitation for speculation, reinterpretation, and myth-making that has kept his story alive for over 2 millennia. The ambiguity of his final moments allowed every generation, every culture, and every artist to shape an Alexander that reflected their own values, fears, and fascinations, transforming the historical king into an endlessly adaptable icon. In the centuries immediately following his death, the competing narratives were a matter of raw political power. His successors, the Diadochi, understood that controlling the story of his death was crucial to legitimizing their own rule. Those who favored the natural illness theory, like Ptolemy in Egypt, used it to present themselves as the dignified stewards of a peaceful transition, the loyal guardians of his legacy. Meanwhile, rivals who found themselves out of power could weaponize the poisoning rumor, painting their enemies as vile regicides and positioning themselves as the righteous avengers of the murdered god-king. This meant that from the very beginning, the mystery was not a passive historical curiosity. It was an active, living tool in a propaganda war, ensuring that the question of how he died would be debated in palaces and military camps across the known world. This political utility quickly bled into the realm of folklore and divine myth. For many of his subjects, particularly in the conquered Persian territories, the idea that a figure of such superhuman energy could simply die of a fever was unthinkable. His death had to be as epic as his life. The rumor of poisoning evolved into a grander narrative of divine wrath or supernatural intervention. Some legends suggested he was struck down for his ambition, for daring to bridge the gap between humanity and the gods. Others whispered that he had not died at all but had been whisked away to heaven by Zeus, or that he slept in a hidden tomb, ready to return in a time of great need. These stories were a testament to his larger-than-life status. His end had to be equally monumental, a cataclysm rather than a medical event. This rich soil of mystery allowed art and literature to flourish. For ancient Roman writers, Alexander became the ultimate tragic figure, a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power. The poisoning narrative fit perfectly into this mold, allowing playwrights and historians to explore themes of betrayal, jealousy, and the inevitable downfall of the mighty. He was compared to their own tragic heroes, a man brought low by the very ambition that raised him up. In the Islamic world, where he was known as Iskandar, stories often purified him into a wise and just ruler, and his mysterious death was sometimes framed as a martyrdom or a divine calling. Each culture refracted the light of his story through its own prism, and the lack of a definitive ending gave them the freedom to invent one. The Renaissance and subsequent eras saw artists drawn to the intense drama of his deathbed scene. Painters like Carl von Piloty captured the palpable tension and grief in the Babylonian palace, the contrast between the still powerful presence of the dying king and the anxious, calculating figures of his generals crowding the room. These artworks are not just representations, they are interpretations, the choice of which moment to depict, whether he is handing his ring to Perdiccas, or struggling to speak, or lying in serene repose, reflects the artist's own belief about what truly happened in that room. The mystery provides the emotional core, the unresolved tension that makes the scene so compelling to paint and to view. Even in our modern era of forensic science and historical analysis, the mystery continues to captivate. It invites us to become detectives, to sift through the same fragmentary evidence and choose a side. Books, documentaries, and scholarly papers continually revisit the case, each one applying new knowledge to this ancient puzzle. This ongoing debate does more than just seek an answer. It keeps us engaged with his entire story. The question of how he died forces us to re-examine who he was, his relationships, his health, his ambitions, and the immense pressures he faced. The man becomes more real, more human, through our endless attempt to solve the riddle of his death. In the end, the greatest legacy of the mystery might not be the myth of a god-king, but the enduring, deeply human fascination with a life that burned too brightly to be extinguished by anything less than a perfect storm of history, biology, and perhaps betrayal. Alexander's mysterious end feels uniquely compelling, but it is far from alone in the annals of history. To truly appreciate the depth of the puzzle he left behind, it helps to place it alongside other famous enigmatic deaths, each a cold case that has captivated scholars and the public for generations. By examining how modern science has revisited these historical figures, we can see a pattern of investigation and draw powerful lessons that apply directly to the question of what happened in Babylon. Consider the case of the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun. For decades, the prevailing theory was that the young king had been murdered, a victim of a blow to the head in a brutal palace coup. This narrative was built on early X-rays of his mummy that seemed to show a bone fragment within his skull. It was a story fit for a dramatic end, a teenage king struck down by treachery. However, when a team led by Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass conducted a comprehensive CT scan of the mummy in 2005, the murder theory began to crumble. The advanced imaging revealed that the damage to his skull likely occurred after death, either during the mummification process or, more probably, by the handlers who first discovered his tomb in the 1920s. The scan instead pointed to a different culprit, a severe compound fracture in his left leg which had become infected. The new theory suggests Tutankhamun, who had genetic markers for weakness and likely used a cane, may have died from complications following a chariot accident or a fall, perhaps compounded by malaria. This shift from a dramatic murder to a tragic accident, guided by technology, shows us how initial, compelling narratives can be completely overturned by objective scientific re-examination, a crucial lesson for anyone convinced that Alexander must have been poisoned. Then there is the strange and somber death of the poet Edgar Allan Poe. Found delirious on the streets of Baltimore in 1849, wearing clothes that were not his own, he died in a hospital 4 days later without ever explaining what had happened to him. The mystery spawned a cottage industry of theories. He was a victim of couping, a form of electoral fraud where people were forced to vote for a candidate multiple times. He succumbed to alcoholism. He had rabies or epilepsy or even carbon monoxide poisoning. For over a century, the romanticized image of the tortured artist dying of drink held sway. But modern medical historians, sifting through the scattered accounts of his final days, have leaned toward more tangible, if less poetic, explanations. Rabies emerged as a strong candidate as it explains his hydrophobia and delirium, though the lack of a reported animal bite makes it uncertain. Another compelling theory points to a brain tumor which could have caused the erratic behavior and ultimate collapse. Poe's case teaches us about the danger of cultural bias. The desire for a death that fits a person's artistic legend can powerfully overshadow more probable, if mundane, medical explanations. This is a direct parallel to Alexander, whose godlike status immediately fueled divine or sinister explanations for his death, potentially obscuring a simpler biological truth. Perhaps the most pertinent comparison is with Napoleon Bonaparte. The French emperor's death in exile on the remote island of St. Helena in 1821 was officially attributed to stomach cancer, a condition that ran in his family. But the persistent rumor that he was murdered by arsenic poisoning administered by his British captors refused to die. For over a century, it remained a historical footnote until a literal lock of hair changed everything. In the 1960s, neutron activation analysis of a preserved sample of Napoleon's hair revealed astonishingly high levels of arsenic. The murder theory exploded back into the mainstream. However, later, more sophisticated analysis told a more complex story. While the arsenic levels were indeed high, they were consistent over time, suggesting a chronic, low-level exposure rather than a single lethal dose. The source was likely his environment, the arsenic-based dyes in his wallpaper or the medications he was given, not a deliberate assassin. The cancer theory was further bolstered by modern forensics. A 2007 study that analyzed the emperor's trousers showed a dramatic weight loss in his final months, a hallmark of advanced gastric cancer. Napoleon's case is a masterclass in the evolution of a historical investigation. It shows how a single piece of evidence can reignite a theory, but how truly solving the case requires a holistic view that reconciles all the evidence, from toxicology to the patient's physical symptoms. For Alexander, it underscores the critical importance of environmental factors and pre-existing conditions. Even if poison were present in his system, it wouldn't necessarily mean murder. The common thread running through these cases is the revolutionary impact of modern science. CT scans, DNA analysis, and advanced toxicology have given us tools that the original historians and physicians could never have imagined. These tools allow us to move beyond the biases, political agendas, and limited medical knowledge that shaped the original accounts. They let the physical evidence speak for itself. Yet, as these cases also show, science rarely provides a single, simple answer. it often complicates the narrative, replacing a good story with a more nuanced and sometimes less satisfying truth. So, what lessons do these comparative cases offer for Alexander the Great? First, we must be deeply suspicious of the earliest stories, which were often shaped by the victors who needed to control the narrative for their own political gain, just as Napoleon's captors had an interest in a natural death explanation. Second, we must resist the allure of the most dramatic theory. The idea of a grand assassination plot is inherently more thrilling than death by typhoid or a failing liver. But as Tutankhamun's case proves, the thrilling story is not always the true one. Finally, and most importantly, these cases teach us that a definitive answer likely requires physical evidence we may never have. Our investigation into Alexander's death is handicapped in a way these others were not. We cannot CT scan his body. We cannot test a lock of his hair for traces of hellebore or strychnine. We are left with the same ambiguous texts, but now armed with the knowledge from these other historical autopsies, a knowledge that urges caution, values science over story, and acknowledges that sometimes the greatest mysteries are born from the simplest of tragedies. And so, after more than 2,300 years, we are left not with an answer, but with a profound and enduring mystery. We have walked through the grand halls of the Babylonian palace and the sterile environment of a modern pathology lab. We have considered a tragic illness, a calculated poisoning, and the slow, cumulative toll of a life lived at the absolute edge of human endurance. Each theory, from typhoid fever to Guillain-Barré syndrome, from a poisoned crater to a mosquito's bite, presents a compelling and internally consistent narrative. Each one fits pieces of the puzzle perfectly, yet none can claim to hold the final, definitive piece that completes the picture without doubt. The reason this question remains so tantalizingly unresolved lies in the very nature of historical investigation itself. We are not dealing with a fresh crime scene, but with whispered echoes across millennia. The original evidence is irretrievably lost, filtered through the biases of ancient historians who were themselves crafting a story, and weaponized by the warring successors who had everything to gain by controlling the narrative. The mystery endures because it is fundamentally unsolvable with the tools we currently possess. It exists in that fascinating space between history and legend, where facts become stories and stories harden into myth. This is not a failure of scholarship, but rather a testament to the immense complexity of the past. Alexander's death is a classic cold case, one where the motives are clear, the suspects are numerous, but the murder weapon is missing. What this entire journey reveals is that how a great man dies is often just as revealing as how he lived. The frantic, violent, and self-serving scramble for power that erupted before his body was even cold tells us more about the fragile nature of his empire than any map of its borders ever could. It shows us that his incredible charisma and will were the only glue holding that vast, fractured world together. His death forced every ambition, every fear, and every rivalry into the open, setting the stage for centuries of warfare and the birth of new kingdoms. In a very real way, the world we live in today was shaped by the chaotic aftermath of those feverish days in Babylon. This is more than just an academic debate. It is a window into the human condition. It speaks to our endless fascination with power, betrayal, and the vulnerability of even the most invincible figures. We are drawn to this story because it combines the logical intrigue of a detective novel with the epic scale of a Shakespearean tragedy. It allows us to be detectives, to sift through the clues and form our own judgments, connecting with history on a personal level. Now we turn the investigation over to you. After this deep dive into the evidence, the motives, and the medical possibilities, which theory resonates most strongly? Do you see a conqueror brought low by the microscopic realities of the ancient world, finally succumbing to a common bacterium in the water? Or do you see a shadowy cabal of his own generals, orchestrating the perfect crime under the cover of a celebratory feast? Perhaps you find the tragic irony of a lifestyle-related collapse, or the fascinating modern diagnosis of an autoimmune disorder to be the most compelling narrative? The floor is yours. Share your verdict in the comments below. Let's continue this great debate and see which theory stands as the most persuasive in the court of public opinion.